The morning sun cast long shadows through the ornate windows of Valdoria Palace as Princess Elena walked slowly down the marble corridor toward the throne room. Her heels clicked rhythmically against the polished floor, each step echoing the weight of the decision she had carried for months. The palace staff noticed something different about her today. There was a finality in her movements, a quiet determination that hadn't been there before. Elena had always been the golden child of the Valdorian royal family. At 28, she possessed everything the kingdom expected from their beloved princess: grace, intelligence, and an unwavering dedication to duty. Her marriage to Prince Alexander of neighboring Astoria had been heralded as the union of the century, bringing together two powerful kingdoms in what appeared to be a perfect love story. The media adored them, the people celebrated their every appearance, and even the most cynical observers believed they had found true love within an arranged alliance. But behind the palace walls, away from the cameras and the cheering crowds, Elena had been drowning. The weight of royal expectations had slowly crushed her spirit over the past 3 years of marriage. Every smile had to be measured, every word carefully chosen, every emotion buried beneath layers of protocol and propriety. She had become a beautiful statue, admired but not truly alive. Alexander, meanwhile, had thrown himself into his duties as future king with an intensity that left little room for the intimate moments that had once defined their relationship. Their conversations had become discussions of state matters, their private time filled with briefings and preparation for public appearances. He loved her, she knew that much, but he loved the crown more. And Elena had begun to understand that she was merely an accessory to his destiny, a beautiful piece in the grand chess game of royal succession. The turning point had come 3 weeks earlier during a private dinner in their chambers. Alexander had been discussing the upcoming trade negotiations with the eastern provinces when Elena had quietly mentioned feeling unwell. Without looking up from his papers, he had suggested she see the royal physician and had continued outlining his strategy for the meetings. That moment of dismissal, so casual yet so complete, had crystallized everything Elena had been feeling into a sharp, painful clarity. Since then, she had been making preparations. Secret meetings with her personal lawyer, hushed phone calls with her childhood friend Sarah, who lived quietly in the countryside, and careful arrangements for a life that existed beyond the palace walls. She had also been writing letters to Alexander, to her parents, to the people of Valdoria who had welcomed her so warmly. But, most importantly, she had been rehearsing the words she would say to her husband today. As Elena approached the royal study where she knew Alexander would be reviewing documents for the morning's council meeting, she paused to gather her thoughts. The hallway was empty except for 2 guards stationed at either end, their presence so familiar they had become part of the palace furniture. She could hear Alexander's voice through the partially open door, speaking with his private secretary about scheduling conflicts and diplomatic protocols. Taking a deep breath, Elena pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped into the study. The room was exactly as she remembered from their early days of marriage when they would spend hours here together, Alexander teaching her about Valdorian history while she shared stories of her homeland. The walls were lined with leather-bound books, portraits of previous monarchs gazed down from their gilded frames, and Alexander's massive desk dominated the center of the room. Alexander looked up from his papers, and, for a moment, Elena saw a flash of the man she had fallen in love with. His dark hair was slightly disheveled from running his hands through it, a habit that appeared whenever he was deep in thought. His blue eyes, which had once looked at her with such tenderness, now held only mild curiosity about her unexpected appearance. "Elena," he said, glancing at his watch, "I thought you had that charity luncheon this afternoon. Shouldn't you be getting ready?" His tone was not unkind, but it carried the distracted quality that had become his default when speaking with her. "Alexander, we need to talk." Elena's voice was steady, though her heart was pounding. "Please, ask Secretary Morrison to leave us alone." Something in her tone must have registered because Alexander's expression sharpened slightly. He nodded to his secretary, who gathered his papers and quietly exited the room, closing the door behind him. The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken words and years of gradual disconnection. Alexander leaned back in his chair, his hands folded in front of him. "What's this about, Elena?" "If it's about the seating arrangements for next week's state dinner, I've already told the protocol office that your preferences should take precedence." Elena almost smiled at how perfectly his response illustrated everything that was wrong between them. Even now, when she was preparing to shatter their world, he assumed she wanted to discuss party planning. No, Alexander. It's not about seating arrangements or charity events or any of the things that seem to occupy every moment of our lives these days. She moved closer to his desk, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to keep them from trembling. It's about us. About what we've become. About what I've become. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. I've been thinking about this for months, and I've made a decision that I know will be difficult for you to understand. For the first time in weeks, Alexander's full attention was focused on her. He set down his pen and looked at her with the kind of concentration he usually reserved for matters of state. Elena, you're starting to worry me. Whatever it is, we can work through it together. We always have. The kindness in his voice, the first real warmth she had heard from him in so long, nearly broke her resolve. But Elena knew that this momentary attention would fade as soon as the immediate crisis passed. They would return to their pattern of polite distance, and she would continue to disappear piece by piece until nothing remained of the woman she had once been. That's just it, Alexander, she said softly. We haven't worked through anything together in years. We've managed problems, we've maintained appearances, we've fulfilled our obligations. But we haven't truly been together, not as husband and wife, not as partners, not even as friends. Alexander's expression was beginning to show real concern now. He stood up from behind his desk and took a step toward her. Elena, I know I've been busy lately with the succession planning and the trade agreements, but that doesn't mean I don't care about you. You're my wife, my future queen. You're the most important thing in my life. Am I? Elena asked, and the quiet pain in her voice stopped Alexander in his tracks. When was the last time you asked me how I was feeling? Not whether I was well enough to attend a function, but how I was actually feeling inside. When was the last time we talked about something other than our duties and obligations? When was the last time you looked at me and saw Elena, not just the Princess of Valdoria? Alexander opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. Elena could see him mentally searching through recent conversations, recent moments, and finding nothing that contradicted her words. The realization was beginning to dawn on him, but it was too late. I've been dying slowly in this palace, Alexander. Elena continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. I've been disappearing piece by piece, becoming nothing more than a beautiful ornament in the crown's collection. And the worst part is that you haven't even noticed. We've been living parallel lives in the same space, going through the motions of a marriage while our actual connection withered away. Elena, please, Alexander said, his voice now carrying a note of desperation. If you're unhappy, we can change things. We can find more time for each other. We can— It's too late for that, Elena interrupted, and something in her tone made Alexander's face go pale. I've already made arrangements. I'm leaving, Alexander. Today, I'm leaving the palace, leaving Valdoria, and leaving this marriage. The words hung in the air between them like a physical barrier. Alexander stared at her as if she had spoken in a foreign language, his mind struggling to process what she had just said. Leaving? Elena, you can't be serious. You're my wife. You're going to be queen. You can't just leave. I can. And I am. Elena replied with a calmness that surprised even her. I've spoken with lawyers. I've made the necessary arrangements. I'm not asking for anything from you or the crown except my freedom. I want a divorce, Alexander. I want my life back. Alexander sank back into his chair as if his legs could no longer support him. The color had drained from his face, and for the first time since Elena had known him, he looked completely lost. This can't be happening, he whispered. Elena, we can fix this. Whatever's wrong, we can fix it. But Elena was already shaking her head. Some things can't be fixed, Alexander. Some things are broken so completely that the only option is to start over. I tried to make this work. I tried to be the princess you needed, the wife you wanted, the future queen this kingdom deserves. But I lost myself completely in the process. She walked around the desk and knelt beside his chair, taking his hands in hers for what she knew would be the last time. I love you, Alexander. I will always love you. But I can't love you at the cost of my own existence. And if you're honest with yourself, you'll admit that you fell in love with the crown long before you ever met me. I was just a convenient way to make your destiny more palatable. Alexander's hands were shaking in hers, and when he looked at her, Elena saw tears forming in his eyes. Elena, please don't do this. Please don't leave me. I promise I'll change. I'll be better. Shoo. Elena said gently, reaching up to touch his face. This isn't about punishment or revenge. This is about survival. I need to find out who I am when I'm not trying to be someone else's idea of perfect. And you need to learn how to love something other than duty and obligation. She stood up, releasing his hands, and Alexander looked up at her with an expression of such pure devastation that Elena had to fight not to take back everything she had just said. But she had come too far to turn back now. My car is waiting, she said quietly. By the time you read this letter, she placed an envelope on his desk. I'll be gone. Please don't try to find me, Alexander. Let me go. Let us both have a chance to find happiness, even if it's not together. Elena moved toward the door, each step requiring tremendous willpower. Behind her, she could hear Alexander calling her name, his voice breaking with each syllable. But she didn't turn around. She couldn't. If she saw his face again, she would never have the strength to leave. As she reached the door, Elena paused with her hand on the handle. Without turning around, she spoke her final words as Princess Elena of Valdoria. I hope someday you'll understand that I'm not leaving because I stopped loving you. I'm leaving because I started loving myself. The heavy oak door closed behind Elena with a soft click that seemed to echo through the study like a gunshot. Alexander stared at the door for several long moments, his mind refusing to process what had just happened. The woman who had been his partner, his anchor, his future queen, had just walked out of his life with a finality that left him feeling completely unmoored. With trembling hands, Alexander reached for the envelope Elena had left on his desk. The cream-colored paper bore his name in her elegant handwriting, the same script that had signed their marriage certificate 3 years ago. As he broke the wax seal bearing her personal crest, Alexander realized that his hands were shaking so violently he could barely unfold the letter. Elena's words, written in her careful hand, began to blur as tears filled his eyes. She had poured her heart onto the page, explaining the slow death of her spirit within the palace walls, the loneliness of their shared bed, the feeling of becoming invisible even to the man who claimed to love her most. She wrote about nights spent staring at the ceiling while he worked late into the morning hours, about conversations that never moved beyond the surface of royal duties, about the growing certainty that she had become nothing more than an accessory to his destiny. I tried to tell you, she had written. In 100 small ways, I tried to show you that I was disappearing. But you were so focused on becoming the king Valdoria needed that you forgot I needed to remain Elena. I don't blame you for this, my darling. The crown is a demanding mistress, and I understand why you chose her over me. But I cannot continue to compete with the throne for my husband's attention. Alexander's chest began to tighten as he read on, the physical pain of her words manifesting in his body. She detailed specific moments that he had forgotten or dismissed, times when she had reached for his hand only to find it occupied with documents, evenings when she had tried to share her thoughts about something other than royal protocol only to have him respond with distraction or gentle redirection back to their duties. The worst part, the letter continued, was not that you stopped seeing me. It was that I stopped seeing myself. I became so focused on being the perfect princess that I forgot how to be Elena. I looked in the mirror each morning and saw only a costume, a role I was playing. The woman I used to be, the one who laughed until her sides hurt, who danced barefoot in the rain, who dreamed of traveling the world and writing poetry. She disappeared so gradually that I didn't notice her leaving until she was completely gone. As Alexander read these words, memories began flooding back with painful clarity. He remembered their early courtship when Elena would share her poetry with him during long walks in the palace gardens. She had been writing a collection about the changing seasons, using nature as a metaphor for the cycles of human emotion. He had found her work beautiful and deeply moving, but somewhere along the way, she had stopped mentioning her writing altogether. When had that happened? How long had it been since he had asked her about her poetry? The realization hit him like a physical blow. He couldn't remember the last time Elena had mentioned any of her personal interests. Her love of horseback riding had gradually given way to official appearances at equestrian events. Her passion for music had been channeled into patron duties for the Royal Symphony. Even her natural empathy and desire to help others had been formalized into carefully scheduled charity work. Every aspect of her personality had been systematically absorbed into her royal role until there was nothing left that was purely hers. Alexander's breathing became labored as the full weight of what he had lost began to settle on him. This wasn't just about a failed marriage. It was about the systematic destruction of the woman he had fallen in love with, and his own complicity in that destruction. He had been so concerned with molding Elena into the perfect future queen that he had never stopped to consider whether that role would leave room for her to remain Elena. The letter continued with Elena's description of the moment she had decided to leave. It hadn't been a single dramatic event, but rather the accumulation of thousands of small deaths of her spirit. The final straw had come during a state dinner the previous month when a visiting dignitary had asked Elena about her interests outside of her royal duties. Alexander remembered the moment. He had been standing nearby, engaged in conversation with the ambassador's wife about trade relations. I opened my mouth to respond. Elena had written, and I realized I had nothing to say. I couldn't think of a single interest, a single passion, a single aspect of my identity that existed independently of my role as your wife and future queen. The dignitary was looking at me expectantly, and I felt completely empty. I mumbled something about enjoying my charity work, and the conversation moved on. But that night, I lay awake next to you and felt like I was drowning in my own life. Alexander remembered that night. He had been reviewing briefing documents for the following day's meetings when Elena had turned toward him in bed and said his name. He had responded without looking up from his papers, asking if she needed anything. She had been quiet for a long moment before saying she was fine and turning away. He had thought nothing of it at the time, but now he understood that it had been another moment when she had reached out and found him unavailable. As he continued reading, Alexander discovered that Elena had been planning her departure for months. She had quietly reconnected with friends from her life before marriage, friends she had gradually lost touch with as royal duties consumed more of her time. She had been seeing a therapist, secretly, because she knew that any mental health concerns would become a matter of state security and public relations management rather than personal healing. I know you will want to find me, the letter read, and I know that the resources of the crown could make that possible. But, I beg you, as someone who once loved me, please let me go. I need time to remember who I am when I'm not trying to be perfect for everyone else. I need to discover whether the woman you fell in love with still exists somewhere beneath all these layers of protocol and expectation. The final paragraphs of the letter were the most devastating. Elena expressed her genuine love for Alexander, her appreciation for the life they had shared, and her hopes for his future happiness. But she also made it clear that their marriage had become a prison for both of them. She had been trapped in a role that was suffocating her, while he had been trapped by his inability to see her as anything other than a component of his royal destiny. I hope that someday you will find someone who can be the Queen Valdoria needs while still remaining herself, Elena had written. And I hope that you will learn to love that person not just as a future queen, but as a complete human being with dreams and fears and needs that extend beyond the requirements of the crown. You deserve that kind of love, Alexander. And so did I. Alexander set the letter down with hands that were now shaking uncontrollably. The study, which had always been his sanctuary, suddenly felt impossibly empty. The silence was broken only by the ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece, each second marking Elena's increasing distance from the palace, from Valdoria, from him. He stood up abruptly, his chair falling backward with a crash that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet room. Alexander began pacing, his mind racing as he tried to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. Elena was gone. His wife, his partner, his future queen had walked away from everything they had built together, and, according to her letter, she was never coming back. The practical implications began to hit him like a series of physical blows. There would be a scandal unlike anything the royal family had faced in generations. The media would descend on them like vultures, picking apart every detail of their marriage and speculating about what had gone wrong. Foreign dignitaries who had been preparing for Elena's eventual coronation would need to be informed. Trade agreements that had been negotiated partially based on their union would need to be reevaluated. But beneath all these practical concerns was a deeper, more personal devastation that Alexander was only beginning to comprehend. Elena had been more than his wife. She had been his connection to humanity in a world that increasingly treated him as a symbol rather than a person. She had been the one person who could make him laugh, who could challenge his ideas, who could remind him that beneath the crown and the titles, he was simply a man who needed love and companionship. Alexander sank to his knees in the middle of the study, overcome by the realization of what he had lost. Not just Elena, but the man he had been when he was with her. In his relentless pursuit of becoming the perfect king, he had sacrificed the parts of himself that had made him capable of being a good husband. He had traded intimacy for duty, love for obligation, and personal connection for political advantage. The weight of his failure pressed down on him like a physical force. He had been entrusted with Elena's happiness, with her well-being, with her very sense of self, and he had systematically destroyed all of it through neglect and misplaced priorities. The woman who had trusted him enough to leave her homeland, her family, and her former life had been driven away by his inability to see her as anything more than a supporting character in his own royal narrative. As Alexander knelt on the floor of his study, surrounded by the symbols of his power and authority, he finally understood the true cost of his ambition. He had gained a crown but lost his heart. He had mastered the art of ruling a kingdom but had forgotten how to love the woman who had chosen to share her life with him. The sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway interrupted his breakdown. Alexander scrambled to his feet, hastily wiping his tears and trying to compose himself as Secretary Morrison's voice called through the door. "Your Highness? The council members have arrived for this morning's meeting." Alexander stared at the door, knowing that beyond it lay a world that would continue to demand his attention, his decisions, his leadership. But, for the first time in his adult life, he had no idea how he would find the strength to play the role that had cost him everything that truly mattered. "Tell them I'll be there in 5 minutes," he managed to say, his voice sounding strange and hollow to his own ears. As the footsteps retreated, Alexander looked around the study that had witnessed the end of his marriage. Elena's letter lay on his desk like a piece of evidence from a crime scene, and, in many ways, that's exactly what it was. He had committed the crime of taking love for granted, of assuming that devotion was inexhaustible, of believing that duty could substitute for genuine human connection. Now he was left with the consequences of his choices, and, for the first time in his life, Alexander understood that being king would never be enough to fill the emptiness that Elena's departure had left behind. The council meeting passed in a blur of voices and documents that Alexander could barely focus on. He sat at the head of the massive mahogany table in the council chamber, surrounded by his most trusted advisors, but he felt completely disconnected from the proceedings. Minister Davidson was discussing agricultural subsidies, Secretary Morrison was reviewing the schedule for next month's state visits, and Defense Minister Clark was outlining security concerns for the upcoming Independence Day celebrations. Their voices seemed to come from a great distance, as if he were listening to them through water. "Your Highness." Minister Davidson's voice cut through Alexander's mental fog. "Did you have any thoughts on the proposed changes to the agricultural tax structure?" Alexander blinked, realizing that all eyes around the table were focused on him expectantly. He had no idea what they had been discussing for the past 20 minutes. Could you repeat the key points, please? I want to make sure I fully understand the implications." Minister Davidson looked slightly puzzled, but launched into a summary of the proposal. As he spoke, Alexander found his attention drifting again to the empty chair beside him, Elena's chair. She had always attended these meetings, contributing insights that were both politically astute and grounded in genuine concern for the people they served. Her absence felt like a physical wound. When the meeting finally ended 2 hours later, Alexander remained seated as his advisors filed out of the chamber. Secretary Morrison lingered behind, clearly sensing that something was wrong but uncertain how to address it. "Your Highness," Morrison said carefully. "Princess Elena missed the charity luncheon this afternoon. The organizers were concerned. Should I reschedule her appearance at tomorrow's museum opening?" The question hit Alexander like a punch to the stomach. Tomorrow's museum opening, next week's state dinner, next month's trade delegation visit. Elena was scheduled to appear at dozens of events over the coming weeks. The entire royal calendar had been built around her presence, and now he would have to find a way to explain her absence without revealing the full truth of what had happened. "Cancel all of the princess's appearances for the rest of the week," Alexander said, his voice strained. "Tell them she's unwell. A minor illness that requires rest." Morrison nodded, though his expression suggested he sensed there was more to the story. "Of course, Your Highness. And shall I have Dr. Reynolds attend to her?" "That won't be necessary," Alexander replied quickly. "She just needs rest. Complete privacy. No visitors, no disturbances." As Morrison left the council chamber, Alexander finally allowed himself to acknowledge the reality he had been avoiding all day. Elena wasn't coming back. This wasn't a temporary separation or a dramatic gesture designed to get his attention. She had planned her departure carefully, and her letter had made it clear that she viewed their marriage as irreparably broken. Alexander made his way through the palace corridors toward their private chambers, dreading what he would find there. As he opened the door to their bedroom, he immediately noticed the subtle signs of Elena's departure. Her jewelry box was gone from the dressing table. The small stack of books she kept on her nightstand had vanished. Her favorite silk robe no longer hung in the bathroom. But it was the absence of her scent that hit him the hardest. The faint fragrance of jasmine that had always lingered in their shared space was already beginning to fade, replaced by the sterile smell of cleaning products. It was as if Elena had been systematically erased from the room they had shared for 3 years. Alexander sank onto the bed, finally, allowing himself to fully comprehend the magnitude of his loss. Elena had been the one constant in his increasingly complex life, the person who could ground him when the pressures of royal duty threatened to overwhelm him. She had been his confidant, his advisor, his lover, his friend. And he had systematically neglected all of those relationships in favor of his obsession with becoming the perfect future king. As evening approached, Alexander found himself wandering the palace halls like a ghost. Every room held memories of Elena. The library where she used to read her poetry aloud to him during their engagement. The music room where she would play piano while he worked on state papers nearby. The gardens where they had taken long walks and dreamed about their future together. In the garden, Alexander stopped beside the rose bush Elena had planted during their first year of marriage. She had chosen it because the blooms reminded her of the sunset, she had said, and she wanted something that would make her think of beautiful endings rather than sad ones. At the time, Alexander had thought it was a romantic sentiment. Now, the irony of her words cut through him like a blade. His phone buzzed with a text message from his younger sister, Princess Margaret, who lived in the capital city with her husband. Haven't heard from Elena today. Is everything all right? She usually responds to my messages. Alexander stared at the message, realizing that he would soon have to tell his family what had happened. His parents, who had grown to love Elena like a daughter. His sister, who had become Elena's closest friend and confidant. The entire extended royal family who had welcomed Elena with open arms and couldn't imagine the monarchy without her. Unable to face that conversation yet, Alexander simply replied, "She's not feeling well. Needs rest." As night fell, Alexander returned to their bedroom and lay on his side of the bed, staring at the empty space where Elena should have been. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to really think about their early relationship before duty and protocol had begun to suffocate their connection. He remembered their second date, when Elena had convinced him to sneak away from his security detail for an hour so they could walk through a local market like ordinary people. She had been enchanted by the simple pleasure of choosing her own flowers from a vendor's stall, of tasting fresh fruit without it being pre-approved by a food safety team. Alexander had been nervous about the security breach, but Elena's joy had been infectious. "Don't you ever miss being normal?" she had asked him as they shared a bag of roasted almonds from a street vendor. "I've never been normal," Alexander had replied. "I don't know what I'm missing." "Then, let me show you," Elena had said, and for the next several months, she had done exactly that. She had taught him the pleasure of spontaneous conversations, of lazy Sunday mornings with no agenda, of making love in the middle of the afternoon simply because they wanted to be close to each other. But, somewhere along the way, Alexander had stopped appreciating those moments of normalcy and had begun to see them as distractions from his real purpose. His father had begun involving him more heavily in state affairs, and Alexander had thrown himself into his royal education with single-minded determination. The man who had once delighted in escaping his duties for stolen moments with Elena had gradually become someone who viewed any time away from work as time wasted. Elena had adapted, as she always did. She had stopped suggesting spontaneous outings and had instead tried to find ways to connect with him within the structured confines of their royal schedule. She had learned to discuss politics and policy, had educated herself about trade agreements and diplomatic protocols so she could be a true partner in his work. But Alexander realized now that what he had seen as supportive partnership, Elena had experienced as the gradual erasure of her own identity. As the hours passed, Alexander found himself going through old photo albums, searching for the moment when everything had started to go wrong. The early photos showed two people who were clearly in love, Elena's eyes bright with happiness, Alexander's smile genuine and unguarded. But, as he progressed through the albums, he could see the subtle changes. Elena's smiles became more practiced, more appropriate, less spontaneous. Alexander's attention in group photos seemed increasingly focused on the camera rather than on his wife. The last album was the most painful to review. Photo after photo showed them at official functions, state dinners, charity galas, and diplomatic receptions. They looked perfect together, elegant, refined, the ideal royal couple. But there was no genuine warmth between them, no secret looks or private jokes captured by the photographers. They had become two people who simply happened to appear in the same photographs. Around 3 in the morning, exhausted by grief and regret, Alexander finally fell into a fitful sleep. But even his dreams offered no escape from the reality of what he had lost. He dreamed of Elena calling his name from somewhere in the palace, but no matter how frantically he searched, he could never find her. He would catch glimpses of her down long corridors or through doorways, but every time he reached the place where he thought she might be, he found only empty rooms. Alexander woke just after dawn, disoriented and still expecting to find Elena beside him. The empty bed felt enormous, and the silence in the room was deafening. For a brief moment, he wondered if the previous day had been a nightmare, but Elena's absence was undeniably real. His first coherent thought was that he needed to find her, to bring her home, to somehow convince her that they could fix their marriage. He could mobilize the palace security team, use government resources to track down her location, employ the full power of the crown to locate his missing wife. But Elena's letter had specifically asked him not to pursue her, and even in his desperation, Alexander recognized that using his royal authority to force her return would only prove her point about their relationship being fundamentally unequal. Instead, Alexander found himself thinking about Elena's words, that she needed time to remember who she was when she wasn't trying to be perfect for everyone else. The more he considered this, the more he began to understand that his own identity had become similarly entangled with his royal role. When had he last done something purely for his own enjoyment? When had he last expressed an opinion that wasn't carefully calculated for political impact? When had he last allowed himself to be vulnerable with another person? The irony wasn't lost on him that Elena's departure had forced him to confront these questions for the first time in years. She had left to find herself, but her absence was compelling him to examine whether he still existed beneath all the layers of duty and protocol that had accumulated around him like armor. As morning light filled their bedroom, Alexander made a decision that surprised him with its clarity. He wouldn't search for Elena, at least not immediately. He would respect her request for space and time. But he would use that time to figure out whether the man she had fallen in love with still existed somewhere inside the future king he had become. And maybe, if he could find that man again, there might be hope for both of them. But first, he had to face the immediate crisis of explaining Elena's absence to a kingdom that adored her and a family that would be devastated by her departure. And he had to find a way to carry on with his royal duties while his personal world lay in ruins around him. The morning after Elena's departure brought no relief from the crushing weight of reality. Alexander had barely slept, and when he finally dragged himself from bed, he found Secretary Morrison waiting in the sitting room with an expression of barely concealed anxiety. "Your Highness," Morrison began carefully, "we have several urgent matters to address. The press office has been receiving inquiries about Princess Elena's absence from yesterday's charity luncheon. Also, your parents have requested an immediate audience with both you and the princess." Alexander felt his stomach drop. King Frederick and Queen Isabella had always been early risers, and their request for an immediate audience meant they had already heard about Elena's missed appearance. His parents were astute enough to know that Elena would never miss a charitable commitment without good reason, and they would demand answers he wasn't ready to give. "Tell my parents I'll meet with them in an hour," Alexander said, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "And tell the press office that Princess Elena is suffering from a minor illness and will be taking a few days of rest." Morrison hesitated. "Your Highness, with respect, that explanation will only hold for so long. The princess has several high-profile commitments this week, including the state dinner for the Meridian ambassador and the opening of the children's hospital wing. The palace has already confirmed her attendance at these events." The mention of the children's hospital opening hit Alexander particularly hard. Elena had been personally involved in planning that facility for over a year, working closely with pediatric specialists to ensure it would provide the best possible care for young patients. It was exactly the kind of meaningful project that had kept Elena connected to her sense of purpose, even as other aspects of her royal role had become increasingly hollow. "Cancel everything," Alexander said flatly. "All of her appearances for the next week." "Sir, that will definitely raise questions," Morrison warned. "Perhaps if Princess Elena could make a brief statement, or if she could appear for just one of the major events." "She can't," Alexander interrupted, the words escaping him before he could stop them. Morrison's eyes widened at the finality in Alexander's tone, and Alexander realized he was going to have to start revealing at least part of the truth. "She's not in the palace right now." Morrison's professional composure faltered slightly. In his 30 years of royal service, he had navigated countless crises, but he clearly sensed that this situation was different. Your Highness, perhaps we should involve the security team? If Princess Elena is unwell and not in the palace, no security team, Alexander said sharply. This is a private matter, Morrison. I need you to trust me on this. After Morrison left to begin the delicate task of rearranging Elena's schedule, Alexander steeled himself for the conversation with his parents. King Frederick and Queen Isabella were waiting in the monarch's private study, the same room where Alexander had announced his engagement to Elena 4 years earlier. The irony of the setting wasn't lost on him. Queen Isabella rose immediately when Alexander entered. At 62, she still possessed the elegant bearing that had made her one of Europe's most admired queens, but her expression was clouded with concern. Alexander, darling, where's Elena? Morrison's explanations don't make sense. She's never missed a charitable commitment, and she certainly wouldn't do so without proper notice. King Frederick, seated behind his desk, was more direct. Son, what's going on? And don't give me the same nonsense about a minor illness. Your mother and I weren't born yesterday. Alexander had prepared several different versions of the truth during his sleepless night, but, faced with his parents' direct questions, he found himself unable to formulate a coherent response. The weight of Elena's departure, combined with his exhaustion and grief, made it impossible to maintain the composed facade he had perfected over years of royal training. She's gone, he said simply, the words falling into the silence like stones into still water. Queen Isabella's face went pale. Gone? What do you mean, gone? Is she hurt? Has something happened to her? She left me, Alexander continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Yesterday morning, she came to my study, told me she couldn't be married to me anymore, and walked out of the palace. She's filed for divorce. The silence that followed was deafening. King Frederick's expression shifted from confusion to shock to something approaching anger. Queen Isabella sank back into her chair, her hand pressed to her chest, as if she was having difficulty breathing. That's impossible, King Frederick said finally. Elena loves you. Anyone can see that. Whatever argument you've had, surely it can be resolved. It wasn't an argument, Alexander replied, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. It was 3 years of me systematically failing as her husband, while being too focused on becoming king to notice what I was destroying. He told them about Elena's letter, about her slow disappearance beneath the weight of royal expectations, about his own blindness to her suffering. As he spoke, he watched his parents' expressions change from disbelief to understanding to deep sadness. Queen Isabella was the first to speak when he finished. Oh, Alexander, she said softly, tears evident in her voice. How did we not see this happening? How did we all fail her so completely? The question hit Alexander like a physical blow because it highlighted something he hadn't fully considered. This failure wasn't entirely his own. The entire royal system, the family structure, the palace culture, all of it had contributed to Elena's erasure. She had been absorbed into the machinery of monarchy so gradually that even people who loved her had failed to notice her disappearance. I have to find her, Alexander said suddenly. I have to bring her home and fix this. But King Frederick shook his head. Son, if Elena has made this decision after 3 years of consideration, charging after her like some romantic hero isn't going to solve anything. It might actually make things worse. So I'm supposed to just let her go? Alexander demanded, his composure finally cracking. I'm supposed to let my wife, my future queen, just disappear because I was too stupid to appreciate what I had. You're supposed to respect her enough to honor her decision, Queen Isabella said gently. Even if it breaks your heart, even if it breaks all of our hearts. Elena trusted us with her happiness, and we failed her. The least we can do now is trust her enough to know what she needs. The conversation continued for another hour, moving from shock through anger to a kind of numb acceptance. They discussed the immediate practical implications, how to handle the media, how to inform the extended family, how to manage the political fallout of a royal divorce. But underneath all the practical concerns was a deeper grief for the loss of Elena herself, who had become beloved by the entire royal family. When Alexander finally left his parents' study, he felt hollowed out, as if the conversation had removed some essential part of himself. The palace corridors that had always felt like home now seemed foreign and unwelcoming. Every portrait of previous royal couples seemed to mock his failure. Every room held memories of Elena that now felt like accusations. He found himself in the palace library, surrounded by thousands of books that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge and wisdom. But none of that wisdom had been enough to teach him how to love his wife properly. None of those books had prepared him for the possibility that success in his royal duties could coexist with complete failure in his personal relationships. As afternoon turned to evening, Alexander began receiving calls and messages from other family members who had heard rumors about Elena's absence. Princess Margaret was the most persistent, finally showing up at the palace when Alexander failed to return her calls. She arrived just as he was picking at a dinner he had no appetite for, her face flushed with worry and determination. "Where is she?" Margaret demanded without preamble. "I've been calling Elena all day, and her phone goes straight to voicemail. The staff keep giving me ridiculous excuses about illness, but Elena would have called me if she was sick." Alexander looked at his sister, Elena's closest friend in the royal family, the person who had helped Elena navigate the complex social dynamics of palace life during her early years as a princess. Margaret had been the one to reassure Elena during moments of doubt, to help her understand the unwritten rules of royal behavior, to provide emotional support when the pressures of public life became overwhelming. "She's gone, Margaret," Alexander said, using the same simple words that had shattered his parents' assumptions earlier that day. "She left me yesterday. She's filed for divorce and disappeared." Margaret's reaction was different from his parents'. Instead of shock or sadness, her expression immediately shifted to anger, but not the anger he had expected. It wasn't directed at Elena for leaving, but at him for driving her away. "What did you do?" Margaret asked, her voice sharp with accusation. "Elena doesn't just leave. Elena doesn't give up on people she loves. What did you do to make her feel like she had no choice?" The question forced Alexander to confront the specific moments of neglect and dismissal that had accumulated into an unbearable pattern. He told Margaret about the dinner conversation Elena had tried to start just weeks earlier, about the poetry she had stopped sharing, about the way he had gradually stopped seeing her as Elena and started seeing her only as his royal wife. "She tried to tell me," Margaret said, her anger giving way to heartbreak. "She came to me several times over the past few months, asking questions about whether I ever felt invisible in my own life, whether I ever wondered if people loved me or just loved the idea of me. I thought she was just having normal doubts about royal life. I never imagined she was talking about you." That night, alone in their bedroom once again, Alexander finally allowed himself to fully break down. The composed future king who had maintained his dignity through state dinners and diplomatic crises collapsed under the weight of his personal failures. He cried for Elena, for the marriage they had lost, for the man he had been before duty and ambition had hardened him into someone incapable of genuine intimacy. But somewhere in that breakdown, Alexander also began to understand something crucial. Elena's departure wasn't just the end of their marriage. It was also an opportunity, perhaps the only opportunity he would ever have, to examine the person he had become and decide whether that person was worth being. For the first time since Elena had walked out of his study, Alexander began to consider the possibility that her leaving might ultimately save both of them from lives of quiet desperation. The question now was whether he could find the courage to become the kind of man who deserved love, even if that love could no longer come from Elena. 3 weeks had passed since Elena's departure, and the palace had settled into a strange new rhythm of carefully managed crisis. The official story of her extended rest for health reasons was beginning to wear thin with the media, but it had bought Alexander time to navigate the immediate shock and begin making longer-term decisions about their future. He was sitting in the same study where Elena had ended their marriage when Secretary Morrison announced an unexpected visitor. "Your Highness, Lady Sarah Pennington is here to see you. She says Princess Elena asked her to deliver something personally." Alexander's heart rate immediately accelerated. Sarah had been Elena's roommate at university, and her closest friend before marriage had consumed Elena's time and social circle. If Elena had sent Sarah to the palace, it meant she was ready to take the next step in formalizing their separation. Sarah entered the study looking uncomfortable but determined. Alexander had met her only a handful of times during their marriage, at casual gatherings early in their relationship before Elena's social life had been completely absorbed into royal obligations. She was a quiet, thoughtful woman who had always struck him as fiercely loyal to Elena. "Your Highness," Sarah said, offering a small curtsy that felt more like a formality she was enduring than a gesture of respect. "Please, just Alexander," he said. "We're not exactly in a formal setting here. You have something from Elena." Sarah reached into her bag, and, withdrew a thick manila envelope. She asked me to bring you these documents personally. She also asked me to answer any questions you might have about her current situation, within reason. Alexander took the envelope with hands that trembled slightly. The weight of it suggested official legal documents, probably divorce papers, custody agreements for their shared assets, formal dissolution of their royal union. He set it on his desk without opening it, not quite ready to face the legal finality of what Elena had already made emotionally clear. How is she? He asked instead. Sarah's expression softened slightly. She's complicated. Some days, she seems lighter than I've seen her in years. She's remembering things about herself that I think she had forgotten. Her sense of humor, her spontaneity, her ability to make decisions based on what she actually wants rather than what's expected. But other days, she's grieving. This isn't easy for her, Alexander. She didn't leave because she stopped loving you. Then why? Alexander asked, though he knew the answer would only confirm what Elena had already told him. Because she was disappearing, Sarah said simply. The Elena I knew in university was vibrant and passionate and full of ideas about how she wanted to change the world. She wrote poetry that made people cry. She stayed up all night having philosophical debates. She once organized an entire campus protest against the cafeteria's treatment of workers because she thought it was unjust. That woman was still there when she married you. But she got smaller every year. Alexander absorbed this, recognizing the Elena that Sarah described, but realizing how long it had been since he had seen those qualities in his wife. What's in the envelope? Divorce papers, primarily, Sarah confirmed. But also something else. Elena spent a lot of time writing you a longer letter. She wanted to explain things more thoroughly than she could in the moment she left. Alexander's throat tightened. Did you read it? Parts of it, Sarah admitted. She asked for my input on some sections. Alexander, she doesn't hate you. She's not trying to punish you or hurt you. She's trying to save both of your lives. That evening, after Sarah had left, Alexander finally opened Elena's envelope. The legal documents were as straightforward as expected: a request for divorce, division of personal property, a formal renunciation of her titles, and claims to the Valdorian throne. Elena was asking for nothing beyond her personal belongings and the financial independence to start over. But it was the second letter that destroyed him completely. Elena had written 20 pages in her careful handwriting, detailing not just the problems in their marriage, but also her hopes for both of their futures. She wrote about the Alexander she had fallen in love with, a man who had been curious about the world beyond palace walls, who had genuinely cared about the people he would someday rule, who had made her laugh until her sides ached. I know that man still exists inside you, she had written. I caught glimpses of him even in our final months together, usually in unguarded moments when you forgot to be the perfect future king. But that man was drowning under the weight of expectations and responsibilities, just like I was drowning under the weight of trying to be perfect for you. She wrote about specific memories from their courtship and early marriage, moments when they had connected as complete human beings rather than as royal figures performing their designated roles. A late-night conversation about his fears regarding the heavy responsibilities of kingship. A morning when they had cooked breakfast together and ended up having a food fight instead. An evening when they had attended a small jazz club incognito and danced to music that had nothing to do with state functions or diplomatic necessities. I miss that Alexander, Elena continued. I miss the man who would rather talk about books than trade agreements, who used to wonder aloud about what it would be like to travel somewhere without a security detail, who once told me that his greatest fear wasn't failing as a king, but becoming someone who cared more about power than about people. But the most devastating part of the letter was Elena's admission of her own failures in their relationship. She acknowledged that she had enabled his neglect by adapting to it rather than confronting it directly. She had become so focused on being the perfect royal wife that she had stopped fighting for the marriage itself. I should have insisted on maintaining parts of my life that were separate from our royal duties, she wrote. I should have demanded that we schedule time for our relationship the same way we scheduled time for everything else. I should have told you directly that I was losing myself instead of hoping you would notice and ask. I was so afraid of being seen as selfish or inappropriate that I sacrificed the very qualities that had made you fall in love with me in the first place. Elena's letter went on to describe her vision for both of their futures. She wanted Alexander to rediscover the parts of himself that existed independently of his royal role. She wanted him to find someone who could be a true partner in both his public and private life. And she wanted him to approach that future relationship with the hard-earned wisdom about the importance of maintaining individual identity within a partnership. I hope someday you'll thank me for leaving, she concluded. Not because I want you to be glad I'm gone, but because I want you to become the kind of person who could never let someone you love disappear the way you let me disappear. I want you to be the kind of king who remembers that the people he serves are complete human beings with inner lives and dreams and needs that go beyond what they can offer to the crown. The final paragraph of Elena's letter contained a revelation that hit Alexander like a physical blow. I'm pregnant, Alexander. I found out 2 days before I left, and I've spent these 3 weeks deciding whether to tell you. I've decided I will raise our child away from the palace, away from the expectations and protocols that nearly destroyed both of us. I don't want our son or daughter to grow up thinking that love is something you fit around your obligations rather than something that should be at the center of your life. But I want you to know that this child will grow up hearing stories about the best parts of their father, about the man I fell in love with before we forgot how to love each other. Alexander read the letter 3 times, his emotions cycling through grief, regret, hope, and a devastating new sense of loss. Elena wasn't just ending their marriage. She was starting a family without him, raising his child in a world he would never fully be part of. But underneath all of those emotions was something unexpected: gratitude. Elena had given him the greatest gift possible, the truth about what they had both lost, and a roadmap for how to find it again. She had shown him that the choice between being a good king and being a complete human being was a false one, that the qualities that made someone capable of genuine love were also the qualities that made someone capable of genuine leadership. Over the following days, Alexander began making changes that would have been unthinkable just a month earlier. He started declining non-essential evening meetings, insisting that some part of each day be reserved for activities that had nothing to do with his royal duties. He returned to reading poetry, something he had loved before becoming consumed with political briefings and economic reports. Most importantly, he began having different kinds of conversations with the people around him. Instead of focusing exclusively on their professional functions, he started asking about their personal lives, their hopes, their challenges outside of work. He discovered that Secretary Morrison wrote mystery novels in his spare time, that Minister Davidson was learning to paint watercolors, that his own security chief struggled with the same work-life balance issues that had destroyed Alexander's marriage. 6 months later, Alexander received another letter from Elena, this time with photos of their son, Thomas. The baby had Elena's eyes and Alexander's stubborn chin, and he was beautiful in a way that made Alexander's chest ache with longing and pride. Elena wrote about their son's personality, about her own healing process, about the small cottage where she was raising Thomas near Sarah's family. She also wrote about watching Alexander's recent public appearances and noticing changes in him, a warmth in his interactions with people, a genuineness in his speeches that hadn't been there before. I think you're finding your way back to yourself, she wrote. I'm proud of you for that, and I think Thomas will be proud to have that man as his father, even if we can't all be a family together. Alexander kept that letter in his desk drawer, along with Elena's first devastating goodbye letter. They served as reminders of both his greatest failure and his greatest opportunity, the chance to become the kind of person who could love completely without losing himself, who could serve his people while remaining fundamentally human. He never remarried, though he maintained a relationship with Thomas that grew stronger every year. Elena eventually found love again with a quiet professor who appreciated both her intelligence and her royal experience without being intimidated by either. They exchanged cordial letters about their son and occasionally about matters of state that touched on Elena's unique perspective. Years later, when Alexander became king, his reign was marked by a more personal approach to leadership that surprised many observers. He was known for his genuine connections with ordinary citizens, his willingness to acknowledge uncertainty and ask for help, his insistence that royal protocols serve people rather than the other way around. And sometimes, in quiet moments, Alexander would remember Elena's final words to him in the palace study. I'm leaving because I started loving myself. He had finally learned to do the same, and though it had cost him the woman he loved, it had saved him from becoming a man not worth loving. In the end, Elena had given him the greatest gift possible, the chance to become whole.